Okay, everyone, we're just letting you join the event. We've got a few people messaging now on the chat function to tell us where they're joining from. Oh, there's quite a lot of you coming in now. That's good to see. We'll start the event probably in about 5 minutes or so keep coming in. We'll wait until we've got a critical mass, at least, of people here so that we can get started. And just about the chat function, I should say that we will be moderating it, so I'm sure you'll all use it very respectfully, but just in case, if anyone doesn't, we will reserve the right to kick you off the chat function, but let's hope we can keep chatting nicely as we go along. Do use it to share information and insights, as well as ask questions. We'll be using the chat function through the event. It's a bit of a challenge keeping up with it though, so don't be offended if I don't get to your question or get to your point. I'll do my very best. And you will be able to watch it back afterwards. We are recording this event, and so you'll be able to also see the chat function streaming as we go, so you won't have lost your point. Others will be able to see it afterwards. And we've got some questions submitted from the audience too in advance, so we'll be peppering those through the event as we go. So lots of people coming in from all over the country. Last time we had someone from Australia joining us, so I'm just wondering if anyone's going to beat that. We got Force East Midlands joining us, Bournemouth CLP member, Danielle, Abby from St Albans, Noreen from London. Who else have we got? Lorna from Tunbridge Wells, that's a nice place. Fina from Glasgow, and Catherine Cooper from Rayleigh in Essex. Nikki Vandergag as well from Oxfam has joined us. Welcome, Nikki. And hello from Wiltshire, from Vicky Gill to all panelists. There we are. So I'm starting to run out of eye pace to keep up with all the comments, but keep messaging, keep using the chat function as we go along. For most of you, you'll know that this is the second event that we've run of these Corona Conversations. The other is on our website, so if you want to go back and watch that, please do. So it was a cracking event. I'm sure tonight's will be just as good. We want to really make women visible through this coronavirus crisis. That's the purpose of these events. We've got a whole programme planned, and we'll be announcing that shortly on our website, and we'll certainly keep you posted about that. But if you've got particular issues you want us to raise, if you've got particular questions you want answered and you think others aren't addressing it, then please do email us at events@forcetsociety.org.uk or message us on the chat function here tonight, and we'll do our best to bring it into the conversation. We think it's really fundamentally important that we get the diversity of women's lives visible through this crisis, and we're really concerned, as are 60 other women's organisations who joined with us just a few days ago to launch our campaign Calls to Action, that women have been largely invisible during this crisis so far, whether it be from PPE kit and designing them to fit women's faces and women's bodies, an issue Caroline Criado-Perez has been very vocal about, or the issues of women taking on the unpaid care work, and that's something we're going to be talking about tonight, amongst other things. There are so many ways in which it will impact directly upon women and girls' lives, both in the short term and in the medium and longer term too, and our focus is very much on that. So how are we doing for numbers? Are we getting to a place where I think perhaps we should be starting? We've got Gina from Rotherham, Claire from Exeter, scrolling through. Oh, Sarah from Hornsey Wood Green, that's my local area. I'm in Hornsey Wood Green right now, broadcasting to you from sunny North London. It is still raining here though. So I was quite pleased to have a lockdown event so I didn't have to leave and get wet. I'm just kind of vaguely waiting for someone to tell me when to officially start. We've got enough people in the event. I don't know if anyone else joined the minute silence this morning at 11 o'clock for care workers and frontline workers. I know our panellists are nodding. We actually went out on the street and stood with our neighbours at our gates in North London and remembered them, and it was very touching and moving moment. Although I have to say, I think it really brings home to you the issue of PPE equipment and thinking about social care as well in particular, where we know that deaths are still spiralling through the roof and staff still haven't got the protective kit that they need. It really is one of those fundamental issues that I think we've got so badly wrong through this crisis, and we've left women and other low paid workers severely unprotected, and they're paying, some of them, with their lives as a result of that. 100%, says Mel. Women all stood together. I'm currently helping out in Waitrose, she said. That's really nice. Okay, I think we should get started. I think we've got probably enough of an audience to get the event started. I feel like I've kind of officially started it anyway, because I've been chatting away to everybody. So, welcome to the second in our coronavirus conversations events, brought to you by the Fawcett Society. We are a membership organisation. Please do join us if you can. You can join for as little as £1 a month on our concessionary rates. And we campaign for gender equality and women's rights and have been doing so for many years. And as I said in my preamble, we're really trying to make women visible through this crisis. And so it's really important that we talk about all the issues that affect women's lives. And some groups of women are particularly at risk and particularly vulnerable. And we're going to be focusing on some of those women here tonight. I think what's really important here is that we use these events to give a platform to both different women, different organisations, but also to you. So again, I urge you to use that chat room function. Send us your questions, send us your comments. Engage with us through social media. I should be saying, of course, we'll be tweeting live about this too with our Make the Women Visible hashtag. So please do engage with us on Twitter if you can. And the other thing is really we're going to be running this campaign for some months. So please support the campaign online. There'll be lots of campaign actions for you to get involved with in the weeks and months ahead. And also different ways you can support women's organisations. So not just Fawcett, but all the women's organisations we're featuring here and the many other organisations who have already supported our work. Many of them who are on the front line and desperately in need of resources. So I make an appeal to you now, do support those organisations. Please do give them what you can if you can afford to make a donation, because they really do need it. They're under a lot of pressure at the moment. So let me start by welcoming you and welcoming our panel, because we've got a fantastic panel to engage in our conversation this evening. I'm going to read out a little intro about each of them, and then we're going to go straight into questions, and it'll be done as a sort of Q&A style format. So hopefully lots of opportunity for engagement both with them and with you. First, I want to introduce Abena Oppong-asare, who is the MP for Erith and Thamesmead, and who was elected just recently at the last election. She's also PPS to Analyst, who is Shadow Chancellor. As part of the Shadow Treasury team, Abena has been assisting in developing Labour's economic policies and holding the government to account over financial inequalities in the face of coronavirus. Abena is also a member of the Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee and has been examining the impact of coronavirus on the homeless and private renters. As chair of Labour Women's Network, she's also been active in improving female representation within the party in leadership positions and has been vocal about the inequalities facing women today and throughout history. So welcome, Abena.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Fahmida Rahman is Research and Policy Analyst at the Resolution Foundation, where her work focuses on incomes and inequality. She takes a keen interest in structural and intersectional inequalities relating to race, gender and social class, among others, and has written extensively on these topics. Prior to joining Resolution, she worked as a civil servant in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and Home Office. And I should say Resolution Foundation, I think, have been exceptional in the last few weeks and published some really important and influential work, and have been really at the forefront of, I think, forcing the government and pushing the government to do some of the more important mitigating actions that we know that they've been announcing. So really delighted to have Fahmida with us. Welcome, Fahmida.
Thank you.
Katie Wood joins us and is instead of Ros Bragg. Ros is poorly, so we send Ros our best wishes. But Katie Wood is the Senior Legal Officer at Maternity Action. And Maternity Action is the UK's maternity rights charity dedicated to promoting, protecting and enhancing the rights of all pregnant women, new mothers and their families to employment, social security and healthcare. Maternity Action campaigns to challenge pregnancy discrimination at work, strengthen redundancy protections for new mothers, improve support for asylum-seeking women, and ensures access to maternity care for vulnerable migrant women too. Katie's a barrister with over 20 years' experience advising on pregnancy, maternity and sex discrimination in the workplace, and runs Maternity Action's free legal advice line. Welcome, Katie.
Thank you.
And now I turn to Hannah Williams, who is the Women's Officer for the Independent Workers' Union of Great Britain. Now, Hannah was recently elected Women and Non-Binary Officer for the IWGB, Couriers and Logistics Branch. She works as a courier day-to-day in the North East, and she aims to be a voice for female and non-binary workers and to break down barriers and stereotypes which may prevent women from achieving what they want in the workplace. She suffers with chronic illness and disabilities and has been an advocate for others with disabilities as well, and has set up support groups for those in need. She also runs a food bank from her home with the help of family and friends, and is currently supporting a number of new clients due to COVID-19. So Hannah, thank you very much for joining us. So I should have said this is about women struggling to survive through this crisis, and I think we've got all the right kind of expertise on the panel to focus on. But I wanted to start off really with Katie and focus on women who are pregnant in the workplace in particular, who are facing the anxiety of going into labour through this crisis. That's another issue affecting them. Can you tell us a bit more, Katie, about the kind of issues that are coming through your advice line and that women are raising with you now?
Yes, absolutely, Sam. I suppose it's worth pointing out that the need for advice on pregnancy and maternity rights is very high at the best of times. But obviously, since this crisis started, we have been inundated with very distressed callers. Many have lost their jobs, much of their income just as they're about to have a baby. So most of our calls have been about sick pay, health and safety at work, the impact that that's going to have on their maternity pay. We're getting a lot of calls from women who've been refused work from home, perhaps because it's assumed that they will be doing the childcare and will be busy. Calls about the coronavirus job retention scheme, obviously where employees can be furloughed on 80% of their pay. And what's interesting is that women returning from maternity leave are being refused furlough. Their employers are asking them, well, can't you just take a bit more unpaid leave? When everyone else is expecting to be put on furlough on 80% of their pay. Or they're having their furlough pay based on 80% of their maternity pay. So that's 80% of £150 a week. And so this is one of the things that we've campaigned for and has been amended, in fact, so that women should have their furlough pay based on their normal salary and shouldn't be disadvantaged by having taken a recent period of maternity leave, and that applies to adoption leave and shared parental leave as well. But I think really the critical issue that we've been dealing with over the last few weeks has been the huge lack of clarity about pregnant women in the workplace during this crisis. And so the Prime Minister and the Chief Medical Officer announced on the 16th of March that pregnant women were in the vulnerable category, along with those over 70 and those with underlying health conditions, and that they were told in the press conference to self-isolate for 12 weeks. And as a result, many pregnant women that we've spoken to were sent home on statutory sick pay of £95 a week. A week later, the coronavirus job retention scheme was announced, and most of their colleagues were sent home on 80% of their normal pay. In fact, government guidance turned out to be that all of us should socially distance, and pregnant women and those in the vulnerable group should be extra specially careful to practice social distancing, so that pregnant women should be able to work from home wherever possible, avoid public transport, keep 2 meters apart. But really, this has caused enormous confusion right from the start. And it turns out that self-isolation is only for those with coronavirus symptoms, or where a family member has coronavirus symptoms, and it's really only in those cases if you are actually off sick yourself or you're self-isolating with symptoms that you should be paid statutory sick pay. And so this has caused huge problems, and there's been a complete lack of guidance on health and safety rights during pregnancy, and a complete lack of thought about how do we protect this vulnerable group, and how do we protect their incomes. And I think this is going to become even more relevant as some of the restrictions start to be lifted, but we still need to think about how we protect this particular group.
And Katie, just clarify for us in particular, thinking about pregnant women working, say, as a nurse or a care worker, who are really in a position of potentially being exposed to the virus, in potentially quite heavy exposure to the virus. What have they got the right to do? Have they got the right to refuse to work and say, I don't feel safe?
there are existing health and safety rights for pregnant women in the workplace. I mean, this has been the case for more than 20 years now. And employers have a legal obligation to carry out a risk assessment for all workers. You know, this protects us as well in our workplaces. But they must specifically look at risks to pregnant women and their baby, and they must take action to remove those risks. And you know, government guidance has really badly been missing, and we haven't heard from the Health and Safety Executive in all of this either. You know, employers have a legal obligation to make reasonable adjustments to ensure that pregnant women can work safely, and in particular at the moment this should be to ensure that they can work safely in line with government guidance on social distancing. And if they can't work safely from home, or it's not possible for them to do their so if they can't work safely in their workplace, they can't do their job from home, then they have the right to be suspended on full pay. You know, and it's absolutely not acceptable that pregnant women should be deemed to be incapable of work and treated as being off sick. And so we're hearing from many women working in care homes, supermarkets, chemists, for instance, who can't do their job from home. You know, social distancing in their workplace is completely unrealistic. And so if they can't be provided with safe work, they are entitled to suspension. And it's very unfortunate that government guidance hasn't addressed these health and safety rights. I mean, the furlough scheme, for instance, specifically says that employers can put employees onto furlough if their children are off school. But it doesn't mention that this should be provided, you know, to help employers cover the costs of pregnant women who are unable to work during this pandemic. But, you know, yes, definitely there is health and safety protection there. You know, these rights do exist, and it's just very unfortunate that there's been a complete lack of guidance on this.
Yeah, very good question. Where is the Health and Safety Executive right now on any of this stuff? Because I haven't seen or heard from them. Perhaps they'd like to tweet us or message us, and we can have them on at one of our future meetings, and we can hear directly from them, because I think it would be nice if they fulfilled their duty to promote equality, which covers all public bodies. Hannah, can I turn to you now to think about some of the members that you represent in your union, because they are, many of them, well, virtually all of them, aren't they, very low paid workers. I was watching the news yesterday, and there was a report about a courier in York who was fined on the spot for driving his bike through the centre of town. He was taking some essential items, you know, medical items which had to be delivered, and he got fined for doing that. So effectively he was out there as a sort of emergency service, but wasn't recognised as such. Tell us about more about the kind of work that your members do and the kind of challenges they face.
Well, I mean, a lot of our members are some of the most precarious workers in the United Kingdom at the moment. We represent cleaners, couriers, private hire drivers, and a lot of those people are sometimes even below minimum wage when you're paying your expenses. And many of our members are LIMB workers, so we don't actually qualify for things like SSP, and a lot of other sort of self-employment sort of benefits and grants that other people may get. But I think the principle is that if you're earning below a certain income threshold, you are not classed as an employee. So even if you do qualify, you're on what, £95 a week for your SSP. So you may be able to get by for a little while, but in the current climate of needing to take 2 weeks off if you need to self-isolate, it's not enough, and we're not sort of protected in the same way that other employees are. So our union sort of looks to represent the workers who don't have the same employment rights that maybe other employees do.
Yeah, that's a really important role, isn't it? And Abena, you've been campaigning for postal workers recently. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and them as key workers on the front line?
Yeah, the reason that I highlighted it as I was supporting a campaign that was out there, but also the fact at the moment that postal workers are, I'd say their workload has increased significantly, and I would say that it's not really recognised about the risks they're taking, because they're out and about delivering stuff that, you know, at our doorsteps, particularly as we're all being required to stay at home because of safety nets, and what you're seeing is an increase of people ordering stuff online. And it's just about recognising and also making sure people remember that actually social distancing applies when your postie comes to deliver at your door, because it can, which literally just happened to me just now, which people can easily forget. In terms of the type of issues that I've been coming across as a local MP, is I'd say that my case workload has changed dramatically. Before COVID happened, I would say that most of my casework was related to general things such as related to housing, people in temporary accommodation, people needed help with housing and immigration. It's now switched a lot, where it's very varied in terms of issues related to employment practices. You know, as Katie mentioned earlier about concerns, particularly pregnant women in terms of furlough, their rights. So I have heard of individuals who have been told by their employers, actually, why don't you go on maternity leave early, instead of going and taking furlough, because which I think is very wrong. And also the legislation on this is very grey. I don't think the government has quite got up to speed in terms of the issues related to furlough, in terms of how some employees are abusing it or not very clear about it. Other queries that I get are issues related to people stranded abroad, and I've got quite a number of women that are stranded abroad, and the situation is getting really desperate, where I'm literally having people contact me on a daily basis, and I'm really concerned about their mental well-being, and the lack of support as well. I also get contacted by quite a number of women who are self-employed, who have faced barriers, particularly those that work in the creative industries. One of the things I'm particularly concerned about is if we don't provide support to them now, we're going to lose a bunch of skills. These individuals contribute so much to our economy, and once they go, it's going to be very difficult to get people to replace them. And other issues I think I'm particularly concerned about is key workers, where you see a lot of women playing those roles. So one of my constituents was Esther, who died. She was a nurse in Queen Elizabeth Hospital. She's of ethnic minority background. You're seeing a lot of ethnic minorities essentially playing a lot of role on the frontline services, but I just don't think that they've been appropriately given the right kind of PPE equipment. In my area, I worked with the Greenwich Council, which is one of the councils where we actually did a shout out, which was ridiculous, to arts companies and individuals to donate protective equipment for those in care homes, because they didn't necessarily have the right gloves or masks to be protected. And you see a lot of women doing those roles, and I just think it's really important that they are supported. But other things that I think that we haven't really spoken about on a national level is the amount of support that individuals receive in their own homes from carers. Those individuals, I'm worried about how it's affecting them mentally, where some of them are homebound. I'm worried about the fact that, you know, they might be living by themselves, how it's going to affect them mentally, and the lack of support. And I think there are so many lessons we can learn post-COVID going on, and making sure that people are, particularly carers, are adequately paid, because they are very lowly paid. But right now, they are literally the ones keeping us safe right now in terms of the whole COVID crisis.
Absolutely. And just a quick heads up, we've got the 50th anniversary of the Equal Pay Act in May, and we're going to be focusing heavily on valuing women and valuing carers in particular, because we do have to, you know, turn all of this genuine sort of public concern into action, so that actually we change the way we think about these roles, and we change the way we value them. We really start to value them properly. I think there are a number of issues you've raised there, which I think we're going to come back to, but I just want to come to Fahmida now to just give us the perspective from Resolution Foundation. And, you know, Fahmida, you do some brilliant work calculating the kind of big picture numbers on all of this. So tell us a bit more about, you know, when we're talking about vulnerable workers, when we're talking about the lowest paid workers, who fundamentally are we talking about? Give us an idea of the kind of people that are in that category.
Yeah, so Erith has been doing a fair bit of work looking at the profiles of those most affected by the crisis, and it is as we all expected, women who are most affected. And this sort of happens in two ways. So firstly, 36% of women are key workers facing the biggest health risks. So they're the people putting their lives on the line. And that's compared to about 18% of men. So twice the proportion of women. So you can understand the gravity of that. And secondly, women are more likely to work in shutdown sectors and are less likely to be able to work from home. So that means, as well as facing the greatest health risks, the economic hit is harder for women as a whole. Now, it's not just women, it's important to recognise within this that certain groups of women will be hit much, much harder. So I think the first thing that we need to be aware of is that it's people on low pay who are the most hit, and those people are much, much more likely to be in insecure work, atypical work, 0 hours contracts, that kind of thing. And these people are really bearing the brunt of this. So around a quarter of people in the bottom pay decile are in shutdown sectors. So that gives you an idea sort of who. And the reason why this is so gendered is because those people who are in low pay, who are in insecure work, who are being overwhelmingly affected, are much more likely to be women. And they're even more likely to be mothers, and disproportionately single mothers. So around 2/3 of single parents are either key workers or in locked down sectors. And given that 90% of single parents are women, we can sort of say quite fairly that the majority of this is women who are disproportionately affected. And then the last group that I sort of talk about is BAME women, or disabled women, or people who face like labour market disadvantage, labour market discrimination, who are again much more likely to be in low paid or insecure work, who by virtue of being in those roles will be most affected as well.
And you raised the issue of single parents there, and one of the comments I noticed from the chat function was pleading with us to raise the issues affecting single parents, not least the emotional pressure they're under because they're the only parents look after the children. So they're taking those extra risks, but actually they're very conscious that the children are just 100% on them if the other partner isn't around at all. And they're facing increased childcare costs in order to work because they've lost their casual childcare options. So, you know, grandparents aren't able to help at the moment, for example. So it's really important, I think, and we've got some polling coming out with the Women's Budget Group in the next week or so. And already through that, we can see that single parents are disproportionately impacted. I want to come back to the point about BAME workers in particular, because obviously we have seen them more at risk, and a disproportionate number of both those who are seriously ill with COVID, but also the fatalities on the front line have been Black, Asian and minority ethnic people. And there's a question from Carmel who asked, as BAME people are represented at higher levels in serious effects from COVID-19 and fatalities, what steps should the workplace take to mitigate it? So what additional steps should the employers take, and what research could be undertaken? And is this pattern replicated across the world? And I don't think we really know probably the answer to the last question, but Abena, can you tell us a little bit more about Labour's inquiry into the disproportionate impact on people?
So Baroness Doreen Lawrence has been appointed to be the race relations advisor by Keir Starmer to actually look into this, to kind of address the fact that COVID has disproportionately affected ethnic minorities. I think it's important to highlight that I think this is a good step forward. I've been really concerned about speculation and comments that have been made by individuals or so-called experts as to what the case is. For example, the lack of vitamin D, or things that I found quite offensive in terms of the fact that it's impacted Muslim individuals because of the fact there's loads of people in the household, when actually I think that's factually incorrect. I think these inequalities existed well before COVID in terms of ethnic minorities, in terms of the type of jobs they were doing. I think it's important to recognise that quite a substantial amount of ethnic minorities already work on frontline services, playing key worker roles. But I think part of the problem is the fact that there have been issues of unfairness in terms of how they're treated in the workplace. But for us to be able to really look at this, we actually do need to start capturing the data. So one of the things that I'm quite keen on is, and I've called for this as well, and other colleagues of mine are also calling for this, is the fact that when someone dies, you don't actually get the ethnicity data. You tend to get the age and the gender. And I think that through this whole crisis, it's been quite problematic, because we have been finding it really difficult, particularly in my conversations when I'm regularly having conversations with the local authorities. The data is not recorded, but we can see that there is evidence that ethnic minorities are disproportionately affected by this. I'm regularly contacted by people that work in frontline services who have told me that they are being discriminated in the workplace, where they're being told to work in unsafe conditions. People are scared about speaking out about this because they don't feel that anyone's really going to listen to them. In terms of the COVID bill, there are some things in the COVID bill that I'm concerned about. So, for example, the use of police powers. I don't think that, you know, if you look at the statistics, generally ethnic minorities particularly are more likely to be stopped and searched and disproportionately affected by the police. And the way that the COVID bill operates at the moment with that, there is no clear clarity in terms of how officers will be using those powers. There's no clear clarity in terms of what the rights of individuals who are unfairly stopped by the police, that how they can use it. So I think this appointment by Keir for Doreen Lawrence is a good step forward. And I like the work that Resolution Foundation has also done on this as well, along with other organisations, in terms of trying to address what the issue is. I also just wanted to say that I have seen some stats in where America have also it's impacted ethnic minorities. They're much greater, but obviously we can't compare the two countries, because the way they capture their data is very different to how we do it.
Yeah, and this is always a problem when we don't get the disaggregated data, or we don't get comparable data. So then you end up in a place where you can't necessarily make the kind of informed decisions or judgments that you need. And we've certainly supported that call for disaggregated data by sex, ethnicity and disability and so on. Katie, I want to come back to you now to think about the impact on women, in particular in terms of caring roles, because one of the questions that's come up through from our audience has been, one woman, Claire Matisova, who said, speaking to a woman last week who was in tears due to the stress of balancing homeschooling and childcare with work concerns, that she's not doing enough work. She's managing about 2 hours a day. She's trying to juggle everything. Her husband's working from home and he's not really playing his part and doing his fair share of the caring. And this is certainly a pattern we've seen on other chat sites as well, in terms of the unequal impact of caring roles. How is this again playing out for either new mums or pregnant women who are contacting you? Are they concerned about how this is going to impact on them?
Yes, definitely. As I said, a lot of them are finding it difficult to be allowed to work from home, because it's assumed that they will be the primary carer and will be doing the homeschooling and all the rest of it. So they're having difficulties negotiating that. But equally as well, I mean, the furlough guidance specifically said that furlough could be used for parents who are unable to work because they have children off school. And and that's welcome clarification in the guidance. But it's strange with the furlough, I think, how reluctant some employers have been to use it. I think there have been some genuine concerns from employers feeling that, that when they come to claim the money through the HMR scheme, that they won't actually get it. I think there were concerns at the beginning that furlough should only be used for in redundancy situations, and it turned out not to be the case. It has actually been introduced to enable employers to cope with quite a wide range of situations.
The guidance did have to change, didn't it? They didn't.
There is a slight reputational risk. Sorry, Sam, I didn't catch that.
I'm just saying the government had to change the guidance. They started off being very clear it was about preventing redundancy.
Yes.
And then sort of
right.
weeks later, they changed the guidance.
Yes, so it has. I mean, I think it's welcome that it has been broadened, and it's clearly now it is about supporting employers to continue to employ employees and to, you know, maintain most of their income wherever possible. But I mean, definitely on our advice line, we are still hearing that a lot of women are really struggling to get the work from home or to be furloughed, and also very worried about their jobs going forward.
And thinking now about the benefit system, because obviously if they're not furloughed and they're able to stay in work, then they end up potentially either made redundant or unemployed and claiming benefits. What kind of experiences are women having when they're trying to claim universal credit or other benefits that they may need?
Yeah, I mean, and there's a lot of existing problems with universal credit. There's the 5-week delay for women who are suffering a sudden drop in income once they go on to their maternity leave. They may have to, you know, keep reapplying for universal credit because they may only be eligible at the point at which they go on to the really lower rate of statutory maternity pay. I mean, the other problem that we're getting a lot on our advice line is that with so many pregnant women who were wrongly sent home and paid statutory sick pay, this is going to have a huge impact on their income during pregnancy, you know, in the lead up to the start of their maternity leave, but it also affects their maternity pay. And so many families now are dependent on universal credit to top up a fall in their income. But statutory maternity pay and maternity allowance are treated completely differently under the universal credit rules. So the statutory maternity pay is largely disregarded. Maternity allowance is deducted in full. And I mean, this is an arbitrary difference. They're both maternity pay. They're both ultimately government funded. And a woman needs to have worked for at least 6 months in order to qualify. I mean, this particular issue is going to judicial review in June. Maternity allowance is meant to be a safety net to ensure that all working women have some form of maternity pay after the birth of their baby. But, you know, this difference in treatment is causing a lot of hardship. It particularly affects self-employed women because they can only access maternity allowance. It particularly affects low-income women, and more women are going to be forced onto maternity allowance because of this crisis, because of what's happening to their jobs during pregnancy. And this is going to have a huge impact on their eligibility for universal credit. Over the 9-month maternity leave period, a woman on maternity allowance will lose about £4,000 compared to a woman on statutory maternity pay who is eligible for help through universal credit. So it makes a big difference, and it can mean that many of the lowest income women cannot get passported onto some of those other benefits like the Sure Start Maternity Grant, which is there to help low income families with the cost of a new baby.
And is there anything women can do about that? They can't refuse it, can they? They end up in that position and they're not in power to refuse to go into maternity allowance.
No, I mean, actually the situation for many is if they need help through universal credit to top up their income or their family income and their rent, in many cases, because any maternity allowance they claim would just be deducted from the universal credit, it's often not worth their while to claim it anymore. And so they feel very hard done by. They feel cheated out of their maternity pay, actually, you know, and it removes that incentive. You know, universal credit is, supposed to make work pay. And actually it means for many women that there's absolutely no incentive to have worked and to have become eligible for maternity allowance. They're absolutely no better off in claiming universal credit. And
Hannah, can I come back to you now?
So complete disincentive.
Credit and the benefit system. So we've had a question come through the chat function, which I'll read to you. How should job centres and other employment-related services women who are unemployed or on a low income, both now and once lockdown is lifted? Will our traditional work first approach be appropriate, which has currently been suspended at the moment? I think we might have lost Hannah. Have we lost Hannah? Okay, she's frozen. I'm going to go to Fahmida with that question. So Fahmida, can you just give us your thoughts on universal credit and the extent to which working as it currently is, and reflecting on that question that I've just asked, can we expect the job centre to run as normal?
Look, there's a bit of an echo and I didn't quite hear the question. I don't know where the echo is coming from.
It's about universal credit. And is it working at the moment?
Oh, so yeah, so universal credit had to pick up a lot of the slack from the labour market. So since the lockdown, we've seen a huge surge in numbers and around 6 times the normal amount of applications. And actually, I think universal credit hasn't collapsed under the weight of that. It's coped quite well. But I think the issue with universal credit isn't whether it's coping, it's the generosity of the actual benefits. So universal credit's been in decline for the past decade. And so even with the £20 boost that's been offered, and other changes, the replacement rates for people going onto UC, so people losing their incomes, the amount that they get back is less than half of what comparable employees on the retention scheme are getting. So really, universal credit barely bites in terms of supporting people's incomes. And then you've got the sort of really rough edges in universal credit. So things like the 2-child limit and the benefit cap, which sort of further limit what people can get, which again, it's one of those things that disproportionately affects women, disproportionately affects parents, single parents. And so it's just another way in which women are sort of hit harder in the crisis. So I think universal credit, it's a social security net and it's there, but it's not quite fit for purpose in terms of the amount of people going on it, the extent to which it supports people's incomes. It's just not doing what it should.
And thinking about some of those changes that you've just highlighted there, these are things that we have certainly been calling for in the past alongside many others. You know, we need to pay directly to women, not to households. We need to include other children in the household, not just have this 2-child limit. Do you think there's any prospect of government making any of those changes to the universal credit system? They seem to be quite sort of defensive about it at the moment.
Well, it's something that I certainly like to see the government do, especially given that most of those affected by the crisis are the people who benefit most from the boost. And I think another thing that we've seen is that, so we've done a bit of analysis looking at how the local housing allowance boost interacts with the benefit cap, and actually it's families with children who are most likely to hit the cap as a result of the boost. So it's sort of cutting off the additional support that the government have given, really sort of undermining what the additional support that they've tried to give, that and various other things that limit the amount of benefits that people can get. So it's certainly something I'd like to see the government do. In terms of will they do it, I don't know, and I honestly can't see it happening in the near future, but I think it's something that we should definitely keep pressing and keep pushing for, because it's such a fundamental change that will boost the incomes of so many particularly sort of vulnerable families who are facing some quite uncertain times.
And we've just had a question come through on the chat function, which I was going to ask anyway, but I shall ask it now, which is, can you speak a bit about how COVID-19 affects women with disabilities, please? Seems to have been missing so far from the discussion. So Fahmida, is there anything in the data you wanted to highlight? And then I'll go to Hannah, I think he's back with us now.
So we haven't looked explicitly at women with disabilities, but it goes back to what I was saying before. So people who are disabled, people who are BA, people who sort of face like structural disadvantage in the labour market, people who are already in low paid work, in insecure work, are sort of more likely to be affected. They're the people who are more likely to work in the sectors that have been shut down, and that has a huge impact. And I think especially for disabled people, the costs that those people face are much higher than the costs that people who do not have disabilities face. And I think losing their jobs and having sort of lower replacement rates if they're going on to universal credit, or even just having their incomes drop down to 80%, is likely to have a much deeper impact than it is to someone who doesn't have a disability and who doesn't have to cover those extra costs.
Absolutely. And Hannah, I just wanted to come to you now. Can you hear me okay? I know you're having troubles with your connection. Okay. Can you just give us a perspective, both from your perspective personally, but also from your union's perspective, about the extent to which the universal credit and the benefit system is in any way meeting the needs of your members and
I think people are struggling with even trying to simply access someone to speak to for universal credit. I was in a queue the other day, well, a couple of weeks ago now, trying to speak to a human being about universal credit, and I was placed 120 something thousand in a queue. You know, and if you're working, if you're a key worker and you don't have time to sit and do that, it's setting you at a disadvantage where you straight away can't access that, and you know anyway that it's probably going to be 6 weeks before you'll see a payment anyway. And I think with, as Fahmida said, with some of the costs that can be associated with disability, you know, we've got to take into account things like carers, medication, adaptations to the home. There's so many disability related costs that maybe people don't take into consideration, that SSP or £95 a week is not going to cut, considering I think Scope a couple of years ago did they looked at it, and basically people with disabilities sometimes face a cost of around £500 extra a month just because of their disability. So if we're looking at the current system and the current sort of set amount of money that you can get if you need it right now, it's not sufficient. It's not sufficient for anyone anyway, let alone sufficient for someone who's got additional needs on top of that, in my opinion.
And one of the issues I know that's been raised with us by Sisters of Frida and other disability rights campaigners is the concern that the Coronavirus Act that was passed in a hurry through Parliament actually removed some of the duties on local authorities to provide care to disabled people in their homes. So they've lost independence, they've lost some of those hard-fought rights. Abena wants to come in on that point. You're muted, Abena.
Hi. Yeah, that's one of the biggest concerns that I had with the COVID bill, with the suspension of the Care Act of 2014. So essentially it removes the further duties, particularly on local councils in terms of delivering support, particularly with people with disabilities. In terms of cases that I've been contacted, I am worried about the fact that there hasn't been much of a discussion about what support should be given to people with disabilities. So I've been contacted by constituents who have had difficulties getting food delivered to their house because they're not really recognised as a vulnerable person, or have had issues in terms of difficulty getting out their house to use, say, for example, public transport and trains, for example, because their concerns haven't been really mitigated because we're focusing on the broader scheme. I think that there needs to be more of a support provided to particularly with people with disabilities, particularly in terms of looking at their mental support. Local authorities also need to be making sure that whenever they're carrying out a duty of care to their constituents, residents, that they're making sure that all the needs, particularly those that are disabled, are taken into consideration. So it is something that I'm concerned about. I feel that by removing the Care Act, suspending it for the 2014 Care Act, it was one of the biggest mistakes that the government can actually do in terms of doing that. I just wanted to quickly broadly touch on the fact that today, this afternoon, we were looking at the domestic abuse bill, second reading of the bill, and I think there are some concerns I do have with the bill, and I think it's good that it's gone forward. But one of the things that I felt was particularly lacking was I felt it was quite thin in terms of support providing to disabled people that may be victims of domestic violence, because in terms of the figures, it's much more higher amongst people that are disabled, and there's less support for them in terms of who they can reach out to than those that aren't disabled. So yeah,
absolutely, because often they're dependent on the very people who are also abusing them, so it's incredibly significant for disabled women. Absolutely. I want to now just turn to the question of how we emerge from the lockdown. So we've been very much sort of focusing on the immediate crisis, and that's absolutely right, but just thinking about now a few weeks time, whenever this lockdown starts to loosen, starts to end, what do we think is going to be the kind of immediate impact on women? I mean, Abena, you mentioned domestic abuse there, and I know that many of the women's organisations who are on the front line of that issue are very concerned about increased demand now, but what that demand might turn into in terms of potentially an avalanche of cases when we get the lockdown starting to ease and women can finally feel they can get away from an abusive partner. But we've had no extra resource of any significance anyway yet for women's organisations. Is there any more that you can say about that in terms of the debate in Parliament today?
One of the things that I mentioned in the debate in Parliament, along with other people, was the fact that the Domestic Violence Commissioner, that they should be involved in all the COVID-19 discussions, making sure that there's greater support, particularly to individuals that are affected by domestic violence. Other things that I flagged up was the no recourse to public funds. I don't feel that there is much support geared to individuals that are victims of domestic violence that are from no recourse to public funds. And what I found quite alarming when I was looking into this was the stats where there's evidence where police have reported individuals to the Home Office when they've reported to the police that they're victims of domestic violence. I think we need to be looking at particularly children, looking at support that can be impacted towards children, because I think generally there tends to be, quite rightly so, support geared to the mother or that's a victim. But in terms of broadening out the support to children who are most likely going to be affected by this for the rest of their lives, that's not really kind of looked into. Local government is a big thing, if I'm going to be honest. They are already delivering support to people that are victims of domestic violence, but it's patchy across different councils across the country. And I think that there needs to be more clarity from the government, because the scope in terms of what local government needs to do in terms of delivering services is very narrow. And I think there needs to be more kind of training and support in terms of that aspect. But in terms of post-COVID, what we should be looking at is, I think in terms of what the government has done in terms of like the immediate crisis, they've essentially told local government that they can't evict people, which I think is a really good thing, and making sure that no one is left behind. So a lot of people have been put in hotels, which I think is a temporary measure. And one of the things that I'm particularly concerned about, I know so people that are renting privately, if there's no pressure on them to pay their rent or be evicted within 3 months. What I'm concerned about is once those lockdown measures are lifted, what is going to happen, and it's particularly going to impact a lot of women. And I really want to hear from the government what kind of measures we're going to be putting forward on that, because right now I think we're living for now. We're not really doing as much forward planning, and it's something that we are looking at through my role on the Housing and Community Select Committee, looking at what kind of support the government could be given once we come out of the lockdown, the preparations that they need to be looking at, because there needs to be a clear, strong strategy, because the last thing we want is particularly women to be worse off following post-COVID. And they're the ones that are literally going to be the ones that are going to suffer out of this, and they're already suffering right now, if I'm going to be completely honest.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's exactly where certainly our campaigning focus is going to be in terms of strategic kind of input over time. Katie, can I just come to you to talk about the kind of cliff edge of the sort of end to the furlough and what the impact of that might be on pregnant women at work? Because I think we all already know that they're disproportionately likely to be made redundant. There's this strong research evidence on that. So what do you think is the impact is going to be?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think we need to urgently look at improving protections against redundancy for pregnant women, women on maternity leave, new mothers and new fathers returning from maternity and shared parental leave. I mean, the EHRC research, 5 years ago found that 1 in every 20 new mothers in the workplace are made redundant during pregnancy, maternity leave, or return from work. And currently, the law says that if a woman is at risk of redundancy during maternity leave, she's entitled to be offered a suitable alternative vacancy. I mean, this is quite a weak right, and it's widely ignored. But the government is intending to extend this week right to cover pregnancy and 6 months after the maternity or shared parental leave period. They've already consulted on this, and this was a plan to be brought forward later this year, and that needs to go ahead. But Maternity Action and the Fawcett Society worked together last year in drafting a 10-minute rule bill, which Maria Miller introduced in the last Parliament, and that would have proposed significantly stronger protection against redundancy for pregnant women and new parents. And the bill was based on the sort of what's called the German model of protection, which would have prohibited employers from making a pregnant woman redundant or someone returning from statutory leave for 6 months after their leave, unless there were exceptional circumstances. And that's going to, cover obvious things like where the business or part of the business has closed. We badly need strengthened protection against redundancy, because this is obviously, going to be a huge issue.
But it's unlikely that strength protection will come soon enough, is it, really, in terms of, I completely agree with what you're saying, and we'll totally support you all the way in campaigning for that. But, if the furlough period ends at the end of June or the end of July, whenever it might be, I suppose I'm concerned that we're going to have a bit of a cliff edge. And, if they can't claim 80% of your salary costs back anymore, then they can't afford to keep you on, then we're going to see, pregnant women disproportionately at risk at that point. And so is there any way, do you think we can speed up the focus on the need to change the law to strengthen the protections of pregnant women? And maybe that's where we should be putting our efforts.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
And we get a few more comments on the chat function, so I'm just going to go to that now. One person saying no recourse to public funds is a big concern. Also, women failing habitual residence tests due to loss of worker status. Unclear what is happening over this within DWP. I don't know if you've got any insight into that issue, Hannah or Katie, or even Abena, if you've got any comments on the no recourse to public funds issue, because we know that, again, it's a group particularly at risk. I think there were some additional protections put in place, or temporarily they relaxed that kind of label, didn't they, during this immediate crisis, but I think it's quite minimal.
Yeah, it has been relaxed during this crisis, but one of the things that I'm particularly concerned about is it has been relaxed, but the problem is that particularly local authorities are under a significant pressure to meet their emergent demands. So I don't know if all local authorities are actually providing adequate support in terms of making sure that people, particularly with no recourse to public funds, aren't being left out. It's something that I actually flagged up through the Housing and Local Select Committee to see if they were mapping it out, to see if there had been any issues. They said to me that they weren't aware of any significant issues, because one of the things I was concerned about is the kind of questions that local authorities were asking to see if the individuals had lots of local connections or were localised before they provided them support. But it is something that I am looking into, and some of my colleagues are, because I don't think there has been much discussion in terms of how it's impacting those individuals. I feel that they've been massively left behind, and it's very hard for them to kind of speak up publicly about their experiences because of fear of persecution. So I think it's very much relying on us trying to, behind the scenes, trying to see what we can do to help.
It's a big issue, I guess, for lots of other London MPs too, in terms of the people they're representing. Hannah, can I just come to you now? So thinking about your the issues you're campaigning on, I think you've also launched a legal challenge recently, or you're fundraising for a legal challenge. Would you just tell us a little bit more about that and what the issue is that you're campaigning on?
Yeah, so the legal challenge essentially is about sort of two things. So firstly, it's to argue that the SSP regime sort of discriminates against women and BAME workers. So it's well established that women sort of earn less than men, but also that people from BAME backgrounds are more likely to receive lower earnings and be in insecure employment. So what we're trying to say is that the threshold of earning £120 a week to qualify for the SSP, and the low amount of SSP in itself of being, £95 or £100 a week, it disproportionately impacts women and people from BAME backgrounds. And it also, the sort of second part of the legal case is trying to say that it's challenging the fact that self-employed workers are given sort of a less advantageous help package than regular employees in the self-employment scheme. So we've sent a list of demands to Boris Johnson, and we're currently fundraising, crowdfunding for the legal case at the moment. I think we're about £23,000 out of 30,000. So
we've got to put the link on the chat function. We're putting the link up on the chat function if we haven't already. I'm hoping that it's already been put up, but we'll do that and share that, and hopefully give you a bit of support with that legal case. And we'll happily support on social as well to try and get you to your target. And now I just want to think a little bit about older women and move on to the discussion, think about unpaid care. And often it's middle-aged and older women who are the ones doing the lion's share of that unpaid care work. And we've had a question in from Katie Stiles, who says, some of the most impacted individuals in this crisis are unpaid carers. We have heard little about the increased financial pressures on them, nor on the impact of more caring on them physically and emotionally. What can we do to highlight that the majority of unpaid care is provided by women? And they were at breaking point even before this started, let alone now. So who wants to speak to that? Abena, do you want to come in on that point about care?
Yeah, I think I completely agree with the points there. The financial pressure on carers is, particularly now, is quite extortionate. They currently earn about, 67.25 pence a week. And I for doing over 35 hours plus a week. And I think it's been long overdue in terms of the discussion, making sure that carers are properly paid, particularly in light of what's happening with COVID. They're the ones that are on frontline services, is usually dominated by women. I think Carers UK have actually been calling for a lot of work on this, and post-COVID, I think there is an opportunity to highlight, actually, there needs to be a massive change in the way and the approach the support carers are given. And it's not just about financially increasing their salary, it's about recognising their contributions. We've got carers that don't get paid at all, but they are helping keeping the economy afloat by making sure that support is properly provided to those individuals that need it. And I know that quite a number of unions like Unison have been championing on this as well. And it's about making sure we all come together and making sure that something is done about this. And it's not just about going out every Thursday to clap for all those key workers. It goes beyond that. There needs to be a detailed discussion, particularly in light of right now, what we're seeing is a substantial amount of, particularly in my area, quite a number of them have carers that provide services have either got ill or have had to go into self-isolation. And it's absolutely ridiculous they haven't been given the appropriate PPE equipment to do their work, that my council had to go out and beg people to supply equipment so that they could work safely. That's just ridiculous. I mean, this is 2020. We need to be thinking beyond that.
And we're only just today getting the announcement of testing being rolled out to care homes, for example, as well, and to care staff in those care homes.
Far too late.
Far too late. It's obviously 6 weeks into this crisis. And it's just extraordinary that it's taken us until now to do that, you know, when we've got the highest risk group, the most vulnerable group, and they knew that at the beginning. So I think it's quite extraordinary, and I can't understand why that wasn't addressed earlier on. Fahmida, can I come to you just to come in on this point about both low paid care workers but also unpaid care, because there's a connection between the two, isn't there? And there's something very, you know, we talked about when we were working together on the sort of structurally unsound report that you produced with University College London. So tell us a bit more about valuing care and women's work.
So I think the big connection between sort of these unpaid carers and the social care workforce is that actually the reason why we have so many unpaid carers is because we've significantly underfunded social care for so many years. We haven't put money into it. The UK doesn't have the capacity to provide care for people that need it. And so people who, quite a lot of whom are elderly themselves, are stepping in to fill that role. And I think that has huge impacts on their living standards in a crisis like this. They put themselves at risk to provide that care. And I think it's something that should have been addressed a long time ago. It was a big election issue in the last election and the election before that, but we still haven't seen the funding go into social care to recognise that we need to be funding care properly. And I think it is, again, one of those big gendered issues. Like, we don't value care because we don't value women's work, and ultimately, like, the care being provided is women's work. And so it comes back to those real philosophical questions about the work that we ascribe economic value to and the work that we don't ascribe economic value to. And that's a big reason why we're in this situation now, and the UK is particularly bad compared to other countries. And then that sort of attitude of how we sort of value care and value women's work and value men's work seeps into the paid care work sector. Those attitudes sort of reside, and it means and has meant that traditionally women's jobs, so care work and other jobs as well. So I did some research recently that showed that women, like sectors that are overwhelmingly female, are paid less. And we see that in the pay and remuneration of care work. And I think the big thing that this particular crisis has highlighted is how super important care work is, and how important the work that those frontline workers provide. And I think going forward, we need to be ensuring that not only are they paid well, they're paid a living wage, and that the terms of their work are much better and much more secure, because people who do work in the care sector overwhelmingly work on 0 hours contracts in temporary work, and that has an impact on not only their livelihoods, their well-being, and yeah, sort of in this crisis, we've seen that it's those people in insecure work who are overwhelmingly affected. So this group are sort of doubly affected by it all.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've had a question actually come in which relates to this, so I'll ask it now. Given that many of the workers we're talking about are underpaid and overworked, we're all acknowledging that. How could this crisis be used to push through changes such as pay increases within these sectors? And they're asking, will Fawcett be the ones to lead this? Well, we'll certainly play a leading role. I know there are many other voices who are leading the charge on this, and many of the trade unions and others, but certainly, absolutely, will be there. And that's from Anna Oppong-asare. So how do we convert that anger? How do we convert that unfairness into an outcome which actually means that these workers are better valued? We need to think about how we're going to transform that change, because we're facing a bit of a kind of moral and political challenge. And I asked this question last time of the other panel. I'm going to ask it of you as well. And, you know, this sort of dilemma, you know, is it 1930 or is it 1945? Are we on the cusp of a 10-year depression and, you know, another period of austerity, or are we actually on the cusp of a transformational moment where we could actually have a social security system that actually supports people when they need it, a proper safety net? Are we going to actually value these workers better? How do we convert this crisis?
I think
it's a political question, so I'll come to you first, Abena.
I think that the narrative is changing, particularly in the fact that, particularly with COVID, there's much more of appreciation and acknowledgement in terms of the work that key workers are doing. To date, we've had over 21,000 people in the UK die in over one since yesterday. The figures are around, I think, about 568 approximately. And I think people are seeing the amount of work that particularly key workers, carers are doing. And I've seen, particularly on social media, probably, I know I live in a bubble, I probably share the views as most of those people that I engage with, but I find from conversations that I've had with constituents, there is much more of appreciation, and that things need to change. So I know that, you know, the government has said, you know, the NHS has done better than how, you know, people has expected. But I think that if this was to go on any longer, it would completely fall apart. So for me, as a representative, one of the things I'll be arguing about is the NHS shouldn't disappear. And as Fahmida said, you know, with carers, how is it that retail workers are getting paid more than carers a year for the work they do? And I think there's definitely an argument in terms of making sure that things need to change, but I think it has to be done in a collaborative way. I think politics needs to change, and I think it needs to be done in a way where we're not just trying to like, oh, you're the opposition, let's just attack. I think what we've seen now is, I think that people want things done differently. I want to do politics differently, and I think the way that you can make strong arguments is to basically use examples of people's real life experiences to demonstrate that the policies that, you know, that are currently in place by the government doesn't necessarily work. But, you know, it's not just real life stories, there needs to be a strategy, and that means me working closely with my colleagues also within the Labour side to make sure that we do get the change moving forward. I hope that, you know, that gives the good answer. You know, I hope it doesn't sound like a politician answer, but I'm trying to be real as I can on this.
You sound like someone who's only recently got to Parliament. You haven't been tainted yet, so that's lovely to hear. Fahmida, can I come to you? Because obviously you've got a chair who's David Willits, who's a former Tory minister, and you've got, you know, a sort of left of centre think tank, one would think anyway, with resolutions focused on median and low income workers. So are you hopeful that maybe we can get a new vision, a new deal going forward, and to, you know, and focus on renewal? Build Back Better is the kind of hashtag and slogan that everyone's talking about, including the CBI, the TUC and others. So is there a good way forward?
Yeah, I think if this crisis has taught us anything, it's that we should value work and we should value the work of everyone. I think, like, there have been a lot of quite valid conversations about why have we spent all this time calling certain work low skilled and certain work high skilled, when actually now, when it comes to drawing up the list of key workers, all those people that we thought were low skilled are the people that we need the most. And so I think it comes down to valuing work, but not only valuing work, valuing people. And I think the thing that it's 100%, it's important that we value care workers, we value the key workers, but also we need to recognise that it's not just key workers and sort of healthcare workers who who work for poverty wages, who work for wages that aren't enough to feed their families. Like, we've seen over the past decade or so a huge rise in working poverty, and I think if it's ever going to come to a head, it's going to come to a head now. And I think we should be sort of focusing on pushing for, like, A, better employment rights, but B, sort of ensuring that everyone earns a living wage, a real living wage that not only enables them to sort of like pay for the things that they need, have a decent standard of living, but also be able to support themselves through crises like these. So to have enough money that they have a little bit left over to save or something. I think we really need to sort of think about the living standards that we have as a country, and that the living standards we expect the poor in our country to have, and how we sort of value the work of people who haven't had the same advantages that we've all had, or that most people have had. So I think the thing that needs to come out of this isn't just a push for better wages for care workers, it's better wages for everyone, and to really get the impetus going behind the movement for a living wage, a real living wage for anyone and everyone, really.
And Hannah, coming to you now, thinking about the impact on your members. I mean, if we were to get that, for example, and actually have a real living wage, and, you know, also paid at a decent rate for young workers, I always think it's really invidious that we have this different rate of pay for younger people just because they're younger. You know, it's quite extraordinary, really, in the minimum wage system. So, what difference would that make if we had real living wage rolled out and applied to your members?
I think even just, you know, the equivalent of the London living wage, that it would be enough to cover our expenses, so we aren't, you know, I'm basically in a minus each week when I've got to put in, you know, I'm getting £8 an hour, but then I've got to spend £2.30 an hour on my insurance, then I've got to buy my fuel. So I need to have enough that I can sustain myself once I've paid all of that anyway, because by the time, you know, I get my pay packet each week and pay my insurance and pay everything else, it's gone and there's nothing left for me to basically survive. You know, that's why I'm still living at home right now. You know, it's a struggle, and even just to have, you know, a basic minimum that we didn't go below once we've had our expenses, that would be enough. But I feel like we need some kind of, you know, regulatory or enforcement body in place that can put these things in place for us, because at the moment, you know, even the cases that have ruled that we are workers and we should be getting things like holiday pay and sick pay and granted the same rights as employees, our employers are ignoring that. So we need something in place, some kind of enforcement to roll that out for us, because at the moment our employers are just ignoring it and carrying on just paying us poverty wages and, you know, getting the best of both worlds by saying, well, you're self-employed, so you don't get this, this and this, but we want you to be a slave to us. And that's what we have to do. You know, at the moment, I've had to get a second job to sustain myself because, you know, my wage this week from my work was £26. It's not enough, and it's not fair. And to me, it feels criminal because it's me that's having to deal with it. But, you know, I know we've got members who have got families who've got to pay for a lot more than I do, and I feel for them as well. So we need some kind of basic minimum living wage that we can actually survive on. And the key part is once we paid our expenses, because that's what we struggle with.
And one of the points we made in the chat function is that actually we need a universal basic income and moving towards a wellbeing economy. And I just wondered if any of you had any particular thoughts on that. I'll be honest with you, I can certainly see the case for it in this current crisis, and it's been something that I've never really been massively persuaded of, because I don't think the gender analysis behind the universal basic income is very strong. And I think there are genuine concerns about the extent to which the additional needs of women in particular groups who rely on benefit support would actually be recognised through that, plus the risk of trapping women at home and not necessarily getting them out into the paid labour market. But what do we think about the concept of the UBI? Is it time to really look at that in a serious way? Does anyone have a particular view on that? Fahmida, you're looking kind of puzzled. I'm going to come to you. What do you think? Is Resolution Foundation looking at it?
Sorry, I didn't hear the question.
It was about a universal basic income.
Oh, yeah, I think...
Universal basic income.
Yeah, no, I did hear the question. I thought you asked something after that. Yeah, so it's important that in times like this, a universal basic income would be really, really useful. But I think before we can get there, and I just don't think politically we're there as a country. I don't think the politics would allow for it. I think, I'm personally speaking as me, not as the Resolution Foundation, I think something like universal basic services, or at least sort of making sure that people have their needs met. I think in terms of like where we are towards getting to a universal basic income, we don't even have a social security system that can sort of do its basic job of supporting the incomes of people when they're struggling, especially like a crisis like this has completely tested the capacity of the social security system to cope, to sort of support people's incomes. And all we've seen is a lot of people who would never even imagine themselves end up on benefits, having to sort of navigate a system that's been created to be punitive towards those who end up on it, and having to sort of deal with this idea. So over the years, we've created this narrative of like the hard-working sort of person and the benefit scrounger. And I think a lot of people now sort of falling into the benefit system will be sort of dealing with sort of their own self-perceptions of how do I feel about myself now becoming a benefit claimant. And I think we need to get past all of those hang-ups, and we need to sort of really be able to support the poor and be able to have a functioning security net before we even think about, are we in a place to sort of implement a universal basic income? But in an ideal world, yeah, I'd be pro it.
There's a lovely comment I'm just going to read to you. It's saying, you're right about the social security system, but for those of us who are older, we remember when it worked. It can be done. So it's quite like that comment. I think we have lost touch with it as a basic safety net, and I think we have to get that back, because we've shot holes in that safety net and too many people fall through the gaps. Katie, can I come to you again now? So we've had a bit of a gap before coming to you, but I just want to come back to you before we come to a close. We've got another 10 minutes or so, and we'll have to bring the event to a close. Are there any points there that you want to pick up from a position of the advice further you do for pregnant women? You know, particular benefit system, whether universal basic income would help pregnant women or not? Is that the kind of thing you would look at or support, or have you got concerns about that?
Well, I mean, I think certainly I'd pick up on a lot of the points that other people have mentioned in relation to reforms around employment status. We need to ensure that those that we now recognise as, you know, key workers have stable permanent contracts with rights to well-paid, you know, annual leave and sick leave. I think we also need to address some of the proposals around having a proper enforcement body that's been consulted on already, to ensure that workplace disputes can be resolved more readily and more easily. I think these are essential reforms for working people. And I mean, one of the other issues is that, you know, this pandemic has shown the importance of, you know, essential areas of social welfare, such as, you know, employment and social security advice, and how, you know, we need legal aid. People need legal aid for advice and representation in order to be able to actually access their rights and enforce them. So I think these are really essential reforms. I mean, also picking up on your point about, you know, how so much unpaid care work is done by women. There is a consultation that's proposing, you know, on care work, that is proposing 1 week's unpaid leave for those that care, you know, for elderly family members or others. And I think we have to be very careful not to accept, you know, very small amounts of unpaid leave as if that's somehow a solution, and then government can, you know, tick a box and say we've done something about it. You know, that's not an answer. You know, one of the things we need to look at is strengthening the rights that we have at the moment to ask for flexible work. You know, a request for flexible work can be so easily turned down on quite broad business grounds. And so we need to really strengthen that, so that those who have care and responsibilities do have a much stronger right to challenge a refusal when it's, you know, plainly unreasonable. I think particularly around pregnancy and maternity rights, you know, some of the things that really have been thrown into sharp focus by this current crisis that I've touched on already, which is that we absolutely have to address the low level of awareness and the lack of enforcement around health and safety rights during pregnancy and maternity leave. This has always been a problem. It's been something that we've advised on our advice line for years and years and years, and it's absolutely you know, been a critical issue during this pandemic. You know, we're particularly keen to see reform around maternity pay, maternity allowance, the way that women are penalised under universal credit. You know, all women on maternity pay should also have access to additional help from universal credit if they need it during their maternity leave. And I guess the one other area that really needs to be looked at, on which again there has been a consultation, and we really need movement on this, is to reform shared parental leave. I mean, it hasn't worked. The take-up was too low. And I think the reason it hasn't worked is because it was a policy that was created, you know, during a time of austerity, when there was, you know, a complete reluctance to create any new rights. And that's how that's why it hasn't worked. You know, it was the only way that they could create additional leave for new fathers was to take it away from mothers. And so we really need to look at this system again and ensure that there is a decent period of well-paid maternity leave reserved for the mother, and that both parents have equal individual rights to a period of well-paid parental leave. And this prevents new mothers and new parents from losing so much income during this critical period. So I think those would be our priorities.
We're totally with you there on shared parental leave and also default flexible working, two things we've also been calling for as well. I'm going to come back to you for your final comments now. We've got about 6 minutes left. And just one other point I wanted to flag there before we do is a question that's come through from Sally Young, who's talking about older women, in particular WASPy women who are not baby boomers, who are not well off, they're poorer pensioners, and often they're the ones providing grandparent care for grandchildren, caring for others in their families, but that contribution isn't recognised. And so I just wanted to highlight this issue of the sort of age divide in this whole crisis, because we're seeing older people told to stay away from families. My own kids can't see their grandparents. That causes us quite a lot of concern, and we're obviously concerned for their health too. So we know we have to stay separated from them, but we want to make sure they're okay. We want to make sure that they have what they need, and there are many others in that situation too. Do you think we're going to see this sort of age divide stay with us, the sort of divisions in society get worse? And we already had, I think, age discrimination being one of the kind of forms of discrimination that's most kind of tolerated in our society. We joke about it all the time. We kind of make quite derogatory comments about older people, particularly older women. It's quite common. So I just wanted to, any thoughts about the sort of ageism and age discrimination we're seeing in the system at the moment and how we might deal with that? Abena, what do you think?
Initially, I think the language, particularly in the beginning regarding COVID, where you were just generally hearing discussions that it was just going to impact older individuals, young individuals were going to be fine. I felt that the narrative was quite, in terms of the way people were speaking about it, there was a bit of a divide that, if you're young, you're going to be fine. It's not going to impact you. It's just going to happen to the old people. They've had their time. Not saying that's what people said, but it was very much that kind of narrative. I think one of the concerns I do have is, obviously, we don't know what the outcome of lockdown, the easing of lockdown is going to happen. But there's been discussions floated around that particularly older individuals may have to remain in lockdown for much longer. And some of the issues that I've dealt with are individuals that have had difficulty getting access to various things, such as simple things such as online shopping, going on online shopping for the first time when normally they would go to the shops, and having to wait over a week and not knowing if they were going to get their shopping before I've gone to Morrison's before they've intervened. There is an issue as well, obviously all the local councils have had to sort out a shielding list. Not every single older person wants to be on that shielding list. They want to be able to continue their life as normal. And it's about recognising and respecting the way they would like to live their lives, because sometimes when you take away those responsibilities or that kind of level of power away from them, it makes them deteriorate. And it's about how we use our language when we're engaging, particularly with older members, that it's not done in a patronising way, that their contribution to society is valued. One of the things that I've had major concerns as an MP, and obviously this may sound a bit stereotypical, but I've had concerns about how I'm interacting with all my residents across the constituency, because obviously I'm relying so much on social media now, in terms of using Zoom, using Twitter and Facebook. And when I do speak to some of my constituents, it does become apparent they're not very social, they're not very engaged in social media. So the idea of looking at your mental well-being, just going on YouTube and doing an exercise, that's going to be difficult for some people. And I feel that, we have to look at how we're going to operate in a very different way. And I feel that we've moved to a very digital way really fast, but I'm concerned we're leaving out particularly older members. You know, I can give you an example of an individual in one of my committees who's been struggling to sign in on social media, to sign in on Zoom, to play a role in our committee meetings, you know, and the fact that that's been challenging for him, and when he's used to being accustomed a certain way. And so I think what we need to do is making sure once we come out of COVID that we provide the necessary kind of training if we're moving towards a more digital future, just to make sure that people aren't necessarily left behind, and really being careful about the way we use our language when speaking, particularly about older people, and that it's not done in a patronizing way.
Yeah, absolutely. And this issue of digital exclusion also applies to children from low-income households, maybe who are being homeschooled, don't have all the kind of, you know, laptops and iPads and all the kit to kind of do stuff online. You know, there was nothing done initially, at least by government, to do anything about that. I think there's been a small step forward towards some kids getting access to tech, but it's very minimal. And if we've got prolonged school closures, that's a real concern too. I'm realising we've actually run out of time. Poor chairing.
Sorry.
To the end.
So
No, not at all. We've run out of time. I'm going to give you all one quick final word. If there was something government could announce tomorrow in the press conference at number 10, what would it be? Katie, what would your wish be?
Urgent government guidance to clarify the health and safety rights of pregnant women in the workplace throughout this health crisis, and if those workers can't work safely, then you know how their livelihoods are going to be protected.
Brilliant. Hannah, what would you want?
I want SSP and other employment benefits to be extended to me, and I want a living wage after I've had my expenses. That's all.
Brilliant. Fahmida, what about you? What would you like them to see?
Yeah, so I echo everything that's already been said, but also I think for me, really, an end to the 2-child limit, an end to the benefit cap, and movement on paying everyone a living wage. Those are sort of my key asks, and I think they'd have been my key asks before the crisis and will be beyond the crisis.
And Abena, I'm going to give you last call. What would you want them to announce?
A clear post-COVID recovery strategy. I'm really concerned about the economy, and I don't feel we're prepared for once we come out of lockdown. So I just want to see a clear strategy on that, particularly how we're going to get the economy moving, how we're going to echo what everyone has said. And by the reason I said it is because it incorporates everything, that strategy.
Brilliant. Well, that's what we want to. So
I try to keep it as short as possible.
Totally agree with you on that. I want to say a huge thank you to our panel, Fahmida Rahman from the Resolution Foundation, to Hannah Williams from the Independent Workers Union, Katie Woods from Maternity Action, and Abena Oppong-asare, who's MP for Erith and Thamesmead, and who's given really great insight into both her work as an MP, but also the Select Committee work she's doing. Thank you to everyone who's joined us this evening. We've had fantastic contributions on our chat function, really good to see. I haven't been able to keep up with it all, but we'll be able to watch it again and see it again. Hopefully it should be up live on our website from tomorrow, end of tomorrow. And please do log on again to our website. We're going to have more events posted on there. We'll also be emailing you all to tell you about next events that are coming up. There'll be more coming from us in May. As I said, that's the 50th anniversary of the Equal Pay Act in May, so we'll be talking about valuing women and actually paying them a decent wage. Wouldn't that be lovely? So that's going to be a focus for us, focusing particularly on carers and key workers. If you want to become a member of FORSIT, go to our membership page. You can join up and support us there. You can donate to support our work, but also you can go and donate to support any of the other women's organisations who are campaigning with us. There are 60 of them who have signed up to our campaign calls, many of them doing important work like Maternity Action, who are really on the front line, but also all the domestic abuse and for charities who really need your help. Really, you're at the front line of this crisis for women. So please do support your women's organisations, because they really can't carry on without you. I'm going to sign off there. Thank you all so much for joining, and stay safe, stay well, and tune into our next event, which hopefully will be coming up in the next couple of weeks. Goodbye.